There we are.
Some of our colleagues. Oh, here we go. Yes, Jeremy. We're just waiting for KAMOGELO. There he is. Okay. So, good afternoon. We are now in afternoon. It just feels like it's been an awfully long morning. For me, that is. We've enjoyed some really good sessions thus far. Lots of food for thought, lots of good information, things that we can take away, I think, and learn from. So I have the privilege of, how do we say it, chairing this panel. So I will be the rose amongst the thorns today, because the rest of them here are all men and I'm just the only woman. So the discussion that we're going to do with the panel today is public versus private sector supply chains. And it really becomes quite a topic for discussion because everybody has a differing opinion on it. So if we look at, let me just read. So if we look at the basic distinction of supply chain in terms of the SCORE model, which is plan, source, make, deliver, return, that is what we are looking at in terms of our end-to-end supply chain. So today we want to really unpack the basic distinction between private and public entities, which is ownership. The public sector is controlled by government, while the private sector is headed by individuals that lead and manage corporations and are profit-centric. To some extent, policies, procedures, and legislation would impact how organizations are managed, products delivered, and services executed. However, the generic principles of the end-to-end supply chain shouldn't differ, or should they? So this is what we're going to find out today. We're going to get some differences of opinion. So I just want to do a quick check-in with my panelists, and I've got a really nice diverse of participants here. Everything from private sector, public sector, big corporates, small businesses that have worked here in European countries. So I think we get a really nice a nice difference of opinion. So I'm going to start off, they're going to do their own introductions. So I'm going to start with KAMOGELO. Please, won't you just introduce yourself there, Kamo?
Hi, thanks. I'm KAMOGELO MAMPANE and board member of SAPICS.
Mm-hmm.
I CEO of a company called TUKKER Global Experts. Thanks, TONYA.
Thank you. Jan, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jan TUKKER. I spent a lot of time in corporates working for the Machini Group. I left them in March and have taken a bit of a sabbatical, but in the meantime also opened my own company called BusinessChain, doing supply chain consulting.
Thank you. And I should just mention that Jan had aspirations of playing some golf, but that kind of hasn't worked out the way he planned. So he's keeping very busy. Let's go to SHAUN.
Thanks, Tonya. Good afternoon, everybody. SHAUN Scott. I have an industrial engineering background. I spent the first 20 years in big corporate, left them about 18 years ago, have been doing consulting. It was never intended, but my work is primarily in the public sector. So I do a huge amount of work with government on how to do procurement. Yeah, I don't. You're all concluding I failed. Okay.
Not at all. Okay, Jeremy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Jeremy BASCKIN. I have been working in industry for 27 years for Unilever in various roles across all of the supply chain and also global rollouts across 140 countries for Johnson & Johnson and also for Coca-Cola. And for the last 5 years, I've been helping businesses and organizations go through changes in terms of transformation, putting in new tools, and also working both in the public sector and the private sector in both areas.
Thank you, Jeremy. Sorry, I have to apologize for that. I have a very fierce small dog that thinks that she's a Doberman and makes an awful lot of noise. I have to shut her out. Hopefully she'll be quiet now. Okay, so I'm going to pose one question to all my panelists, and we're going to try and keep some free-flowing information here so everybody gets a chance to put in their thoughts and considerations. So really, we're going to look at their understanding, perspective, and thoughts on, are there similarities between public and private sector supply chain? And if there are, what are they? So I'm going to aim at Jan here to kickstart this part of the conversation, and then we'll move around so everybody can give us their thoughts.
Thanks, Tonya. I must say I did quite a bit of reading up on this too, because I think everybody might have a view of what the differences are, and businesses around the world always like to criticize the government, and in South Africa we're not immune to that, and we have unfortunately lots of good examples or bad examples of badly run state entities, which doesn't help opinion. But the main differences, I think, are who the stakeholders are of the organization. So in the public sector, the government and people of South Africa are the customers, where in the private sector, it's the general public and people who buy your services or products. So that in turn drives a lot of the nature of the organization. So things like where the money comes from, where the funds come from, is also a major thing. In the public sector, it's taxes. So you actually beholden to the people of the country. When the private sector is the sales of the organization, and that drives big differences too. I think the other major topic to talk about is the ease of accountability. So in a private company, the accountability is very distinct and very well documented and very well managed. Our opinion of the public sector is perhaps less so, although I don't know, I've never worked for the public sector, and perhaps there is a lot of accountability. And then lastly, there are a lot of things to talk about. I'm sure everybody else wants to chip in too, but the attractiveness of jobs in both of those sectors perhaps also drives a lot of the opinions around those two environments, where the attractiveness of working for the public sector might be less so than in private sectors. And then perhaps one last comment is the competencies. Now I have access to a report where it talks about competencies and professionalism of supply chain across those two environments. And I think there's no doubt that the professionalism of supply chain in the private sector is higher than in the public sector, and therein lies an opportunity.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to divert straight to Jeremy, and there's a reason for that, because one of the comments that he had made was about the skills and the competencies, and just talk around that specific topic.
Hi, Tonya. I didn't hear the full question because I think you broke up. But I'll continue. I heard skills. So yes, if we just talk about what Jan was starting to talk about with what are those differences, from a practicality on how supply chains operate and run. So what is your demand? What are the resources? What is the supply that you have against that? You'll notice that it's pretty similar, even though you think it's very different from a formal business that is providing to, for instance, a police constabulary or police force. I've worked, do a lot of work in both big businesses and then also in governments and police forces. And when you go into a police force, you start realizing that it's exactly the same. You need to understand, first of all, what is your demand? What is that demand that you're looking at? When are there going to be break-ins? When are they going to be hijacked? And actually, there's quite a big trend. You can actually start predicting that demand. And against that demand that you have, you need different resources or different skills to react to those demands. You've got white collar crimes, you've got domestic abuse, you've got incidents, firearm incidents, etc. So and break-ins, and therefore those skills that you need to attend to those different ones are actually different. But you also need to understand what is that resources that you need. So you come back to this demand supply balancing, and therefore you find that there's actually the same way as you try and understand what you're going to sell from a demand point of view and what you're going to make from a supply point of view is very similar to, for instance, in the public sector. So you find that supply chain piece is similar. The second thing is also those skills that you need. As you can see, there's different skills that you need to deal with the different things that you do, like an operator on a production floor or a forklift driver. There's a different set of skills. There's similarly a different set of skills on what is those crimes that you need to effectively react to. So, there are differences in skills, but the basic foundations of supply chain is the same. What I call. I think where you see a predominantly huge difference is what I call is about decision making. So where do you make those trade-offs when you start having that demand and supply imbalances? What decisions do you make? Because we don't have a finite of resources, we don't have a finite of funds in our public sector, and therefore we need to make some decisions. So in a business, you'll make those, your demand supply chain decisions, and your infrastructure and your network of safety stock or logistics or whatever that is made generally around profitability or growth aspects. When you talk about it from the public sector, those decisions are also generated through budget, but a lot of them are influenced by political. What is the thing that we want to drive? What is the targets that we want to get down? And therefore you start focusing your resources in different crime areas, and therefore you need different things. And it's a political driven, motivated decision making. So what you're seeing is actually the decision making is very different, but the fundamentals are the same. I think you're on mute, Tonya.
This mute button and on. Okay, so KAMOGELO jumped to get his mic off first. So unfortunately, Shaun, you're going to have to go last. KAMOGELO, don't you want to come in with your comments, please?
Oh, no, my mic was always on, sorry, but it's fine. I think, Jeremy, that last statement that says the fundamentals are the same, I fully agree with that. If you look at all the areas, whether you plan, source, make, deliver, return, and you use a word like demand. So there is a thinking, even within the public sector, that you have to understand, and especially if we only talk about supply chain, you have to understand the needs of your stakeholders. And we rightly define who the stakeholders are and who the shareholders are. So for me, the definition of Jan, you explained it very well about who's a shareholder, right? So, and for me, it was very good that you said the same way. So you said the shareholders for private sector are the people that buy, which means people that live in a particular country, in a particular place. Is it not the same shareholder as well from government side that's looking for electricity, water, and all of that? So it's a very same person. It's a still KAMOGELO. I buy my stuff at Woolies, but I expect my house to be electrified by Eskom, which is government. I expect the road to go to the Woolies to be maintained, right? So it's a very same KAMOGELO who is a shareholder or a stakeholder, both in public and private sector. So in essence, for me, the shareholders are exactly the same. The mandate might be different. The mandates that are given to public, private, whoever the way they are, and the way a private company engages with their shareholders or their stakeholders will be different to the way that government does. So government also, in terms of the way they work, they have to make sure that they engage the shareholders and their stakeholder, broader stakeholder, whichever way. So whether you're an investor, whether you are the receiver of the service, there must be an engagement model to understand what are your needs and how do you want these needs to be delivered to you. So for me, the framework in terms of planning is exactly the same. And I guess we also spoke a little bit about skills to say where are these skills from. And later on, I'll probably talk about the top 40 at the JSE, right? And if you look at who are the head of supply chains in those top 40 organizations, where did they start? At least on the top 40, 20 of those have an experience from public sector. 20 of those head of supply chain, they have started or they found their way somehow in their career in public sector. But where did they end up? So we can now expect, for example, the head of supply chain at ABSA, who once used to be in a state organ, that now he's a different person than when he was in public sector. So you have the very same skill, right? But obviously you outgrow and all of that. But the problem, and I think, Jeremy, you said that very well, that if ABSA is looking for a certain skill, they will make sure that they have the resources to get it. The problem in government, they still need that head of supply chain at ABSA to come and run an ESCOM. The problem is they do not have funds or the resources to get that particular skill. So they might say, hey, hang on, we might have to do certain things here. But in terms of the skills that are there, and again, we lump government into one. And thank you. I mean, Jeremy, you made a brilliant example there of the defense industry. If you think about government, you have schedules. You have companies, for example, that have to make their own money. You have companies that are expecting government to give them money. Those that have to fund themselves, they are more like corporate, and that's why they are called companies. And there's very little differences, especially with those. The way they operate, the skills that they need to have to drive the stakeholder value, and you see that involvement, for example, in the big state-owned companies. And it's a similar, not just South Africa. We speak about South Africa, but if you look at other countries, for example, if you look at a country like the Netherlands, and you see the contribution that government makes in the industry, you'll see that probably Netherlands, it's one of the government contributes more than many other countries like the United States in terms of their contribution, in terms of their outsourcing, their partnership with public sector, with private sector. So where there is those interactions, you can imagine if you don't have the skills in government, you have the skills in private sector, but there has to be exchange of product and services. Then that's where we have all of these problems that we are seeing in the country. And we have seen this being emphasized a lot now during COVID, right? How much government, for example, in South Africa, the public pays, it's about 1.1 trillion. The bulk of that is serviced by private sector. So for me, even though we're saying there are differences or similarities, but we must work towards making sure that there is at least an equitable share of resources, capability, systems within public and private sector. And perhaps I'm not giving solution. It's something we can discuss later on. Thanks, Tonya.
Okay, Shaun.
Okay, so at a process level, they're common and they're similar. We buy stuff, we send quotations out, we manage demand, we balance demand and supply. At that level, they're similar. The principles that underpin the processes are very different. In government, we have constitutional requirements that exist in our Constitution, 217 and Section 33 of the Constitution. Those filter right down to a set of laws that the practitioners need to follow And if they don't follow those, there are consequences that end up in court very often, which is very, very different in the private sector. That's the compliance with those set of laws are very, very different. The notion of value in the public sector is completely different to the private sector. The value is not shareholder value. It's around community and citizen value. It's far broader. Yes, there are some institutions, as KAMOGELO said, where there might be more of a shareholder value type concept, but it's very, very different. In the public sector, the whole notion of openness and transparency is fundamentally different, where the contract that you eventually want to sign up with must be disclosed up front. And there should be very little change between what is disclosed up front in the tendering process and what you eventually contract with at the end. At the process level, they're common. Underneath, it's very different.
Thank you, Shaun. So one of the questions I wanna put out now is regarding so we're talking about the cumbersome policies and procedures and that sort of thing that really is a big differentiator. So Jeremy, given that they have this cumbersome legislation and documentation, all these things that they have to comply to, the PFMA and all those good things, does that impact their ability, or does that impact their efficiency? Does that prevent them from being more efficient than they could be?
So I mean, that's a really good question in terms of efficiency, and it's also about how you define efficiency. And some of that around efficiency is, you say, part of that is driven by knowledge and skills. Mm-hmm. And always what you talk about is, we always use benchmarks. This is best practice as a benchmark. But the big problem being is that a lot of people don't know what good looks like. So how can you instruct someone to be good if they don't know what good looks like? And that's where you find in the private sectors, that's where they have grown over time, is because they look at what their competitors are doing and they understand what their competitors are doing, and they say, okay, what they're doing in that particular area, that's good. Let me go and emulate that as good practice. And then it comes back to the organization. What we call a learning organization is because now they understand what good looks like, and therefore they can actually improve and effectively drive those efficiencies. I think the big problem with the public sector is to say, where do they get the examples of what good looks like? And I've been working with quite a few departments recently where they said, okay, where is their best practice in a certain area? Let's go and learn from that particular country of what good looks like. Quite interestingly is and I'm starting to see this to happen around the world, that the public sector are now bringing in people from the private sector. Not people are doing it from a voluntary perspective. So coming back to the point, that was made around the APSA wanted the best supply chain person, so they went and got the best supply chain person who knows what goods looks like. But I would expect, to try and create that in the public sector is quite difficult. But there's no reason why that person cannot go and do some coaching or do some mentoring and say, basically, it doesn't take long. It's, I don't know, an hour or 2 hours of time as you sit down and you say, this is what good looks like. Right, let's talk about a strategy of how we can get there. Right, which of your people in your organization do we need to upskill or show them what good looks like? And there was a really good example in the UK. I was speaking to the head of a constabulary, as a police division. What they did is they actually took a number of their officers and they seconded them into businesses for 3 months. So they seconded them into the private sector to see what good looks like from a private sector point of view. So they went and worked and shadowed in there, and then they came back and they made an immense change. They came with a complete different mindset and a complete different way of doing it, and it hasn't cost a huge amount of money. And those people that have gone and learned, you know what that does for them? It grows those type of people. So I think we should get away from the fact that just saying it's private is public. We need to start sharing with each other and learning with each other and benchmarking with each other to help them to understand what good looks like, so we can make those improvements.
Can I just
I really like that, and I've heard that before. About the people from public sector going into private sector and like job shadowing. So I think it's something that we should try to implement here. How we would go about that, I don't know, but it is a very good idea, and we definitely need to do something like that. So who wants to jump in next?
I wanted to give a South African example because Jeremy gave a UK example, if it's okay. So Shaun will know about this. So a few years ago, the big state-owned companies created what they call a state-owned entity procurement forum. Now, in the main, the state-owned procurement forum was exactly that, to see what good looks like. But beyond just how the good looks like, they also wanted to see they can start sharing resources, but also standardizing, because in those days, for you to complete, for example, if you were to complete a tender from an ESCOM and from the Department of Police, you had, I mean, the state-owned companies, about how many? 700 of them. Each single one had its own tender document. You had to register on 700 databases for you to be able to do business with government. So the ease of doing business was just not there. It was just not there. So state-owned companies started to say, let's look at common things that we can do without getting consultants to come and fix us. Can we at least look ourselves in the mirror and say, oh, this is how it looks like. Can you give me your templates so that I don't have to go and get a consultant to come and change it, and then I'll just rebrand them. Please don't give them to me on a PDF. Give it to me as Word or Excel so that I can implement, just put my logo in there. And that's what it started. And as Shaun knows about that. And that's where the bulk of CPOs, by the way, the bulk of those CPOs that started the state-owned company, the state-owned procurement forum, many of them left, obviously. They started running the telecoms, the ESCOMs, APSA. Some of them went to the mining sector, because they started looking at that to say, what does good look like? Where is it? Can I go and find it? And they started implementing strategic sourcing, for example, even before government wrote anything about it, because they found, is this what category management looks like? Okay. And they started empowering. We started running boot camps, as an example, what we used to call strategic sourcing boot camps. And we brought in private sector CPOs as well. We brought people from the biggest suppliers as well to be part of it, sharing their own experiences and the impact of the work that the state-owned companies are doing. So I just wanted to add to say that, Jeremy, absolutely right. That must continue, and it must be really supported. And we must see, I'm hoping today is not just talk shop, that at least as leaders here today, we should be able to say these proposals we are able to implement. At least let's do something about it, even if it's just at a small scale to start with.
That's a different view, Tonya, if I may add. Why is this discussion important? I think we must understand we're moving this procurement world into a more professional space. We're talking about the profession. We're talking about where is this going, being recognized as a profession on par with other professions that are out there, like in medical and legal, etc. So why is this important? Because I think if we understand the differences between public and private, we can better shape the direction that we're moving in. We can better shape the structures, the institutions that will eventually emerge to help manage and govern this profession. And one of those, and I think they're sufficiently different that it requires a different approach between the two. One of the things, and I've had this discussion with yourself, Tonya, and with SAPICS, is I don't think, for example, that the existing membership organizations which are around sufficiently cater for public sector professions. And so, one of the questions is, so what do we do about that? Do we create a special interest group within SAPICS, or do we create a completely different membership organization? When we start to understand these differences, it is going to start helping us address the questions that Jeremy is asking around skills and competencies. Because the competencies in the public sector are fundamentally different. Yes, at a process level, there's commonalities. What we see is that very often, if we do bring a private sector person into the public sector, and they don't get a grasp of how different it is and how those laws fundamentally change the way that we drive procurement, they drown. And likewise, if we find a public sector person who goes into the private sector and they don't sufficiently understand, or they can't articulate those kinds of things, and they also drown. And so I think, yes, although there is benefit in having a public sector person spend some time in private sector and vice versa, I think we've got to start developing these competencies in a lot more specific, focused manner. We're really starting to get to grips with managing this.
Thank you, Shaun. Jan, you're off mute.
Yes, there's obviously no shortage of enthusiasm on this topic. Got to wait my turn, but I really liked what the other panelists have said, and KAMOGELO, I liked the example about the Netherlands, and I think that it's great us having a discussion here, but we don't represent government or the public sector. So we can talk all we want, and we're going to make no change unless we get the private sector to completely acknowledge that supply chain development is critical. Now, in private companies, sometimes that task is difficult. Sometimes it's difficult to say, hey, supply chain is important. And you're going to fight for your way up. And some organizations have appointed head of supply chain, but not all organizations have done that. So if the private sector is still on a journey on that scale, the public sector has got a long way to go. So how do we influence them to say or to acknowledge that supply chain development is important? And that comes from in the private sector, the CEO drives it, and you can imagine in the private sector, or in the public sector, the government or the president must drive it. So if there is support for that, what it does, it then creates an attractive option for people to go and work there, because they know what they're going to do is important, and that people will listen to them and give them money to make a difference. So the example with the Netherlands, you can think about countries that have good infrastructure, that run well, that have a good procurement process. And in your mind, you'll all be thinking of a variety of those countries, but those countries take supply chain seriously. And they will attract people, the best people. In fact, people will probably go work for those governments rather than in the private sector in some cases. So I think the professionalization of supply chain in South Africa is important. The acknowledgement that it is important needs to happen. And I think Shaun did mention how do we create that process? How do we get us to get there? And this is multi-year. This is not going to happen quickly. It's a multi-year process.
No, indeed it's not. We have been having the discussion in private sector alone around this for a very long time. So much work to be done. I'm interested to hear other thoughts on what Jan has had to say, following on from his discussion in terms of How do we do this? How do we get some traction? Who do we bring in? Yes, we need the government, but where do we even start? It's kind of like, how do we eat elephants? Where do you start biting? I don't know if anybody wants to share some insights on how we eat the elephant, because at the end of the day, and a silly example, you go to the licensing department to renew your driver's license. It is a nightmare, whether you booked it online or not. The process that you have to go through doesn't change. Now, why can we not apply basic supply chain principles to things like that? And this is what boggles my brain, is it's there. So at one point, they've done it with the IDs. They've now partnered with the banks. It works. Why are we not doing that with all the other organizations? So these are things that we need to think about, is how can private add value to public? But then on the flip side of that, how can public add value to private? Because there are skills and things that they have that we're lacking in the private sector. Whether we agree to it or not, they are definitely there. So I don't know who wants to jump in and add some comments on.
Yeah, if I can just comment on that, Tonya, and it's also the point that Jan makes is really important, is that there's a different level of maturity. Every organization has a different level of maturity of how good they are at their supply chains. And we're comparing those ones that are performing well with the public sector, because there's lots of private sectors that the supply chain isn't performing well. And it goes back to Jan's point, is that businesses do not see the importance of supply chains until there's what I call a burning platform, until there's a fire that's happening. And as soon as there's a fire, all of a sudden people realize, oh, the supply chain is important. Actually, we need to have supply chain at the table. And only at that point do you then find that you have a supply chain or chief supply chain officer who actually sits on the board and has decision-making rights. If you look at most companies that you have a look at in private sectors, you'll see that supply chain is either represented by finance on the boards, in majority of them, or some of them might have chief operating officers who might represent it, but very few have at the top. And those ones that have put supply chain at the heart of your business and have put them on the board as an independent person reporting to the CEO, that's where you see the traction, and that's where you see things happening. So it's about, how do we create that burning platform without having a real fire? Because that's where people have moved from in the private sector in the first place. And then obviously it is then saying, actually, do we have a chief supply chain officer as sitting and, at the head of state, or close to the head of state, is there one? And until you get one, then again, like the private sector, it's not taken seriously.
Shaun, you wanted to jump in there.
There's a comment about, great comment there from David around, government must put their money where their mouth is and develop. There's an extraordinary amount of money that is actually spent training people in the public sector on procurement. Mm-hmm. We've got a fundamental issue, though, is that we do not have a public sector qualification in procurement. And even if we take some of those private sector qualifications, or those existing procurement qualifications that are out there, that don't speak to public sector. The most popular one in the country has completely done away with public sector procurement modules. And so, where do we start? I think that's where we start. There's some work that has started in a collaborative forum, and KAMOGELO is very familiar with what's happening there to get that going. But I think that's where we need to start. Is we've got to really get those qualifications bedded down. We've got to ensure that those qualifications recognize the differences and the competencies across private and public. And when that's done, then I think we'll make a big difference.
Thank you, Shaun. So sadly, we've run out of time, and I know that this is a topic that we could talk a lot about. I just don't want to leave this as and we have these talk shops and we just don't want to end up in a position like that. So as supply chain professionals, what do we do to start a movement to do the things that we're talking about today? So I just want to give you all literally like a minute to just give closing remarks and comments. I think we've had a really good discussion. So what are the things that you want to share with the audience that you want them to take away, to remember and to think about in terms of this discussion today? So, KAMOGELO, would you like to?
Yeah, two things. Firstly, there is just for everyone who's here to know that there is a drive to professionalize supply chain in the country. We encourage everyone to be very, very close to that program so that it delivers what we want. It has been driven by a national treasury, and it cannot be left on national treasury to determine the professionalization agenda for this country. It has to be driven by every one of us. If you are a supply chain professional, get closer to that and make sure that you make an input. There was recently a public procurement bill that was issued, but that is for public. But there is a drive now to professionalize. So please, I'll encourage everyone to be part of that process and make sure that it delivers what we want. Otherwise, we're going to sit with a big problem that will take us many, many years to resolve. Lastly, I will read as a commitment from me, and I'm encouraging my panelists to come together. I will take the responsibility of inviting at least the head of supply chains of major SOEs to a round table, whether an hour or two, to have a discussion with them in terms of what do they want to see, what is the input that they want to see from us in private sector, and what can private sector do to assist them in achieving their goals. Or whatever question that you want to put on the table, I make that commitment that let's rather do that. Even if it's about only 10, obviously if you have the ones that you want to bring to the table, let us do that. Then I'm sure we start small. I'm sure that can grow in the future.
Thank you, KAMOGELO. You know this is being recorded. I'm going to hold you to that. Jan, closing remarks.
Yeah, I like what KAMOGELO said. I think, what first came to my mind when you asked the question was offering our help to the public sector, offering our help in terms of the experience we have in our positions and our experience that we've helped businesses grow and become more professional and more efficient. The other thing maybe, is to think about the public sector differently. We all have these negative views, and maybe we should be thinking differently about it and saying we can make a difference. We can help the country be better by offering our help and our experience, and thereby it welcomes them into this discussion, because we have to get them onto the same table. So I think that panel discussion is a good idea, and I'd absolutely like to be part of that.
Thank you, Jan. Shaun?
Public sector procurement is immense. There are 700 different entities that buy. They spend hundreds of billions of rand, more than any private sector organization in Africa. We always see the bad apples. There are many, many, many very, very good projects and people in the public sector. One of those, and I just commend them, is the SKA project. Massive project, which is world-class in many ways, is a public sector procurement project. There are some great projects out there. Let's look for them. Let's support those. Not just look at the bad apples. Thanks, Tonya.
Thank you, Shaun. And I must echo that. I mean, I know people that work in the public sector or who have worked in the public sector that are exceptional, but exceptional skills and have made enormous contributions to those organizations. So 100% right. There are definitely, really good skill sets within the public sector base. Jeremy.
Okay. Last but hopefully not least. Again, I echo the sentiments of, and I think it's a fantastic idea and commitments that we make from the senior people getting together and creating that collaboration. And learning from each other. I think that's brilliant. I think what we also need to think about, and to the rest of the audience as well, is how do we benchmark what good looks like. And I challenge each and every one of you to say, right, this is what I aspire to, and also think about who can you help. You must have colleagues or friends or know people, both in the private and the public sector. Let's get together at your levels. You don't need to wait for us to bring people together from a leadership team. You in your communities and in your areas, start forming that collaboration together and start driving it as what I call a supply chain movement.
There we go.
Sharing best practices.
I like it. I have really enjoyed this conversation. And can I get a word here from our audience? Little virtual clap. Have you enjoyed the panelist discussion? I think it was really, really, really good, and I think it's something we really need to pursue. There are some comments and questions in the chat. We are over time. I don't know if you guys have each got your own little speaker booth. If you would like to just go and park off there for a little while, and if there are some questions, people can come and directly engage with you and ask them to you. But thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your insights and your suggestions. And yes, we will look forward to taking this further, and we'll start with our roundtable. Thank you, KAMOGELO. And we're all on board and we're committed. Let's see what we can do to make a difference. Instead of complaining and moaning, let's take a solution and drive some ideas of solutions and taking it forward. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, everybody. It's time for a well-deserved break. Grab something to eat. Vision booths. Go and enter some competitions to win some prizes. And yeah, just take a break and network. Go to the lounge and network. Talk to people. This is what it's all about. So everybody, cheers for now. We'll see you after our break. Thank you so much.
Thank you, TONYA.